Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Really pleased to be joined by my co-host, Rania Khalek. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we've got two wonderful guests joining us. They've been on our show before, but never together. Medea Benjamin, who is a co-founder of CODEPINK and the co-author of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Welcome, Medea.
Hey, nice to be on with you.
And then Ann Wright, who is a member of CODEPINK, a retired Army colonel, and a former State Department diplomat. Welcome back, Ann.
Good morning.
And we're talking to you in the early morning. Are you in Hawaii?
I am in Hawaii. Aloha.
And Medea in the belly of the beast. Are you in D.C.?
No, I'm actually in Miami.
Oh, well, another beast, the belly of the Cuban right-wing exile beast. That
DeSantis territory.
Yeah. And you're both here. We want to, this is our first interview of the year, our first interview show of the year, our first episode widely available of our show. And we think it's really important to dig into where we're at with the war in Ukraine, and particularly just to begin with what we've seen happen already in the last month, where we crossed this line and tanks are being shipped. I think the U.S. tanks are being shipped to Ukrainian forces. And now everyone's watching and wondering if the next line that crossed is the shipment of fighter jets to Ukraine, which they want. And so, I mean, either of you could take this. We'll start with you, Medea. What does this signal, this mission creep, and how concerning should it be to all of us?
It should be very concerning, and I wish more people in the U.S. were paying attention to this. It seems like every time that Biden says we're not going to send this weapon system, that's a signal that we are going to send that weapon system. And every time there's been a new crossing of a line that we set up ourselves, it is portrayed as, this will really help get victory for Ukraine. Remember the talk about the HIMARS, and everybody starts saying, what is HIMARS? And look it up. And you get some HIMARS in there and the Ukrainians are going to win. Well, that didn't quite work out. And now it's the issue of the tanks. And this has been an interesting push between the U.S. sending tanks and the Germans okaying the sending of their Leopard tanks, not only from Germany, but from other parts of Europe. We'll do it if you do it, kind of thing. And so that line was crossed. And now, as you said, Kevin, it's about the fighter jets. And of course, when Biden says we're not going to do it, that means we're going to do it. So, here we go. And every time there's an escalation, it just means that the Russians are going to escalate further as well. And it gets us down this deep dive into a broader, either a protracted war or a third world war or a nuclear war. And I think that people have to step back and say, where is this going? What is the end game? What does victory look like? And how are we letting our leaders, whether it's Biden or the leaders in Europe, take us down this path instead of calling for negotiations?
Those are all such good points. And one thing that really sticks here is, and Anne, I want to bring this to you because you actually served in government before, or in positions before when it comes to these wars, and you resigned over these wars. And as I'm sure you remember, when it came to Iraq, when it came to Afghanistan, one thing that we constantly heard was that we're doing this for the Iraqi people, we're doing this for the Afghan people. And with the situation in Ukraine, it's that, we have to keep sending in weapons to help the Ukrainians. But actually, from a military perspective, no matter how many tanks the US, Germany, I think even Morocco at this point are sending to Ukraine, it's not really going to change what's happening on the ground, except cause the war to go on longer, lead to more Ukrainian casualties, lead to some more Russian casualties. But at the end of the day, it's really not going to make that much of a difference in terms of like Ukraine being able to actually win. So I just want you to like kind of dissect that for a moment, because I think that that's when like the way that this is sold to a lot of Americans is we have to do this to help save Ukrainians. But as recent history shows, and of course distant history shows, that's always a lie. In this case, what are we actually doing to Ukrainians by continuing to pour weapons into their country?
Well, we're killing them. That's the main thing. I mean, the massive increase in the numbers of civilian casualties that you see in Ukraine and that you see along the border, the Russian border with Ukraine. I mean, it's a bloodbath. It's horrible. I mean, you see apartment buildings being blown up. You see hospitals being hit. You see, it's a horrible, horrible thing. And, increasing it with the numbers of really, really big military equipment, these tanks that can shell things 20 miles away. And also, the strategy of the U.S., which is we will send them, and we want Germany to send them, and you send them right now, but we can't really send any for about a year because we're not going to deplete our own supply of tanks. We're going to manufacture you a couple of them, or 50, 100. Well, that'll take a year and a half, which on one level is good because at least that number of tanks isn't part of the mix. But it does mean that the German government that was saying we're not sending anything, they got suckered into going ahead and saying, okay, we'll send them. It's a huge boon for U.S. manufacturers, for the ones that make the tanks. And then, there's a recent article in the New York Times about all of the industries that make the shells that are fired by these tanks. And, it's a business that starts out in Pennsylvania, making the shells, then explosives are put into them in Arizona. And then, then they go on to, well, it's just a mess. All of this stuff, the replenishment of all of this in a major military conflict is, a boon for our military industrial killer complex.
Yeah, we saw that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and these other companies are marking their year anniversary of reeling in record profits, and now they're offering unprecedented high stock buybacks to shareholders. It's the military weapons industry has never been better, and this is also what they were looking for. They wanted this kind of a conflict and war to roil Eastern Europe. So, and let me ask, both of you, when we're looking at where we are at in this conflict and talking about how long it's going to be and whether it's protracted, what do you feel about the way in which we might be deluding Ukrainians into believing that they can defeat the Russian military? I mean, is there some kind of responsibility, or is there something that should weigh on our conscience as our officials, even though many of these people, I imagine, don't have military training? We're going to send these weapons. They're on their own to figure it out. And we're telling them that they can defeat Russia in this conflict and that they shouldn't negotiate diplomatically. I mean, does it sound like we're just leading them to the slaughter?
Yeah, I think knowing that it was the US and the UK that blew up the negotiations that were happening at the end of March, beginning of April, and the West saying to Zelensky, we're in this with you till victory, has really given this false hope to many Ukrainians that would take us at our word. But first of all, we don't know what victory means, because we're even hearing from US officials differences. Some of them saying that means going back to 2014, getting Russia out of Crimea and all of Donbass, and others say, no, it means going back to February 24th of last year. And then in terms of the attention span or the willingness of particularly the United States is really questionable, because we see that polls show more and more Americans questioning whether they think this is a good idea. We see the Republicans now in the House, Kevin McCarthy himself having questioned the blank check. And as we're having these debates about debt ceiling, about money issues in the United States, you have to think that more and more people, despite not hearing this on the mainstream news, are questioning giving over $100 billion to Ukraine and having to supply Ukraine with billions of dollars every month, not only for the weapons, but just to keep their government going. At some point, this becomes untenable for the United States. And then we have to look at Europe, which has really felt the blowback from the sanctions against Russia, and more Europeans complaining about inflation, the price of energy, the price of groceries, and starting to question their own governments. And so you see divisions within Europe, not only play in leaders like Orban's in Hungary, who won't even go along with the Western sanctions on Russia, but you see it internally in countries like France, the Czech Republic, and Germany, and Italy, where there have been increasing protests, and even members of governments coming out and saying, what is the end game? We can't just keep going like this. So there are bound to be lots of divisions and a call for cutting off this blank check. And as you said, Kevin, that just leaves Ukrainians with a terrible body count, terrible destruction, and in the end, having to negotiate what could have been negotiated last March, because it's the same issues that are on the table. Where is the line in Donbass going to be drawn? The issue of neutrality for Ukraine is going to be the same one back on the table. This could have all been avoided.
And I'll add that as Medea mentions, the huge amount of money that the U.S. is putting in, whether it's in sending weaponry there or just money to help prop up the government. And now we see that Zelensky himself is saying, we have a bit of a problem here. The corruption that is in this government and in the Ukrainian government, and he's just fired essentially the whole customs house of Ukraine. He's sacked some of the people in the Ministry of Defense because they have been corrupt. They've been stealing money from the state. And indeed, at the end of the week, this week, there's a big meeting with the EU on the issue of corruption. So, the more money that is pumped into this, the probability, as not just in Ukraine but in the U.S., as we've seen here, the amount of graft and corruption that can happen when you have these huge amounts of money that go into a country, and particularly a war-torn country that's under siege conditions, essentially. And we saw it in Iraq. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it every place the U.S. is involved in any sort of military conflict. The amount of graft and corruption that is available and taken advantage of by people that have any association with the government is really, really big.
Thanks for watching the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. Please consider becoming a subscriber of our show. Go to thedissenter.org, sign up for $4 a month, and get early access to all our full episodes, as well as exclusive episodes that we post. We're in our 10th season, and we depend on people like you to keep producing conversations and interviews like this one. Thanks again, and now back to this week's episode.
I just want to note that, Medea, you've been going around the country doing a book tour, right? Am I right that you're doing a book tour? The book being War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. It's co-written with Nicholas Davies. And I wanted to ask you about what your interactions with people have been around the country, especially as somebody like yourself who's been organizing against war for as long as I've known you, and even before I've known you. So you've got lots of experience in the anti-war movement and of trying to get people galvanized to show up to protests against war. In this case, going around touring and giving, I assume, talks in different cities around the country, advocating for an end to this proxy war. I'm curious how you would compare the feedback you've received, the attention, the interest you've received, your experience trying to protest against this war, trying to organize against this war, versus other wars in the last couple of decades, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Iraq, or, you know, I know Libya and Syria were difficult to organize around for lots of reasons. I'm curious what your experience has been and how you might compare to the sentiment on the ground around you when it comes to Ukraine versus previous wars.
It was a lot easier to organize against war when the US was the obvious aggressor and when there's a Republican in the White House. It's very hard to get progressives, Democrats, and we saw the disaster in the Progressive Caucus in Congress when they tried to just call a mild letter calling for negotiations. The 30 of them signed and they withdrew within 24 hours. We see how hard it is for people associated or in the Democratic Party to be going against the line of their own president. So those are things that are difficult. It's, of course, become increasingly difficult over the years from the time that I started organizing against war in Vietnam, when it's not U.S. soldiers, U.S. body bags coming back, people pay less attention to it. And I think that people also are hearing the most incredible propaganda from all of the mainstream media about this war and about Ukraine being the epitome of democracy. And as we've been talking about, just throw in more money and more weapons and they will win against the evil Russians. No talk in the mainstream media about the expansion of NATO or the U.S. involvement in the internal affairs of Ukraine and how it helped create the context for this. So people have a very black and white understanding of this. Also, let's add into that the years of hearing about Russiagate that really pumped people in the Democratic Party to say that the Russians were responsible for Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton. And for older people, the Cold War. It wasn't hard to convince people that Russia is the enemy. So you put all of those things together and it becomes very, very difficult. Now, what I'm finding as I travel around is when I speak to people who are more aware and look at other sources of information, like your show, they are much more sympathetic to the call for negotiations. But when it comes from that understanding to wanting to participate in demonstrations, that is a leap. So it's been hard. We've called many times for people to go out and do rallies in their hometowns. And if they're lucky, they'll get 20 or 30 people out. We have been getting people to contact their congressperson, but then they get so cynical about it because they say, you know, Congress doesn't represent me to begin with. They're all a bunch of hawks. They all want to just keep supporting this war. So why should I bother? So you find that people are not inclined to either come to Washington or New York for demonstrations or even organize in their own communities. That being said, the sentiment is there. The anti-war sentiment is broad. I found a lot of agreement. And, you know, one thing that was positive that we saw before the holidays was when we put out this call for faith-based leaders to call for a Christmas truce, and we thought maybe we'd get 100. We got 1,500, and they represented all religions. And I think that's a good barometer of the faith-based community in this country. And then I think now we have efforts to organize within the labor movement, trying to get local unions to sign letters calling for negotiations. We're going to the environmental community to say what a disaster for the environment this war and all wars are, and can they join us? So there are forward movements to bring in more people, but it's been very difficult.
I don't know if, Ann, you have anything to add to that. I mean, you've been a part of anti-war movement building for the last couple of decades as well.
Well, just 2 decades, because before that, I was a part of the system. But
I see a couple of decades. I wasn't too off. Yeah.
not endless decades like Medea. But I will say Medea's coming out here to Hawaii next week, and we have a speaking schedule for her, and it reflects exactly what she's saying. Trying to get groups that want to talk about Ukraine versus her long history in activism and all of the issues that she's been involved in. It's been very difficult to get groups to say, yeah, we want to really hear about Ukraine. We want to hear all the aspects of it. So it really is reflective here in the heart of militarism of the Pacific here in the Hawaiian Islands, where we have the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command that organizes all of the military war games for a potential conflict with China, for God's sakes. Geez, come on. And you would think that there would be more interest in what's happening in Ukraine, because it does have an impact, military impact on military units that are here and the big defense establishment here. But it's been very difficult to get that here in Hawaii, and just to have sign waving out, on the streets of just no war, stop wars, negotiate, stop the killing. We can get maybe 10 people out for that, and that's about it.
We see a lot of cultural pressure, I think we could call it, because Zelensky and Ukrainians have really worked their way in. We're going to see in the next month that at the Academy Awards, all these actors and celebrity figures are going to be showing their support. I'm sure they're going to have their pins. And I don't know, we might even hear from Zelensky, and this all serves to create a pressure to extend this war and not negotiate any kind of a truce. But then again, we know that before we saw Russia invade Ukraine, we had very stern warnings about what lied ahead for the U.S. if they encircled Russia, if they reneged on promises around NATO. George Kennan was a figure who, up to his death, was going through these awakenings, was very public about his own understanding of the risks and the threats that were posed to the United States. And then I have to ask you, though he's a much more reprehensible figure, as somebody who's implicated in genocides, responsible for genocides, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger has had a backlash against him last year because he came out and said after a couple months that there needed to be negotiations now. We needed to do something to end this conflict. And then it seems like the pressure has gotten to him. Even a 99-year-old man who I think would have nothing to lose because age hasn't gotten him yet is bowing to this pressure and saying that he now believes that NATO membership is something that should definitely be on the table for Ukraine, no matter what that might signal for the world. So why don't you, since you're someone who came out of the State Department, you're somebody who understands this culture, what is going on here with this pressure that people are feeling that they're not, that they just abandon everything that they're saying so quickly? Like, they know in their heart of hearts, I think, that this is bad, but once they speak out, when they have this backlash, it doesn't take very long for them to abandon their own ideas.
Well, one other character that I'll add to it is our current director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who was a U.S. ambassador to Moscow and wrote that famous memo, "Yet is yet," that Putin, back in the days when Burns was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, was talking about, don't push on Ukraine membership into NATO. Just don't do it. I mean, this is a dialogue that's been going on for as long as Putin has been in power. And he's been very, very upfront in every international fora that he's spoken in. And in fact, a couple of nights ago on Frontline on PBS, there was a program on Putin, which, to their credit, went through a huge number of international conferences where Putin was saying, don't do this, don't do this. Of course, the Frontline didn't fully expand on all parts of it, but it was, it's a useful documentary to watch, because it's not like this came out of nowhere. And it wasn't, as you've mentioned, it wasn't that people in the government weren't warning about exactly what happened. And it's kind of like, George Bush in the Iraq War. He just went ahead and did it. Same for like Biden. He just, even though the Russians had mobilized 100,000 people right along the Ukrainian border in December and January of 2001, and then 2021, and then 2022. And, I was thinking, well, okay, the Russians are, they're really giving the big signal. Don't keep pushing on this NATO membership. And when there was not even an acknowledgement by the Biden administration of, well, let's go back to the Minsk agreement. Let's really start moving on that. No acknowledgement at all. And then tragically, Putin went ahead and did the attack and the invasion, which is just, in the long run, it's, or in the short run, it's terrible for the Russians, terrible for the Ukrainians, and certainly terrible for U.S. foreign policy, which is now wrapped up in yet one more senseless war.
As we've kind of watched what took place with Russia, with Ukraine, and this proxy war, and sort of priming the American public for it, to the point where there's so little backlash and there's so little political space for the progressives caucus to even like write a letter, right? Like Medea mentioned earlier, without being feeling pressured to like backtrack. Just the letter saying, let's engage in diplomacy. What do you think this means for the issue of like China? And I raise that because we've seen a lot of officials writing op-eds or insinuating that somehow Taiwan should be looking to Ukraine as a lesson, that we should be seeing this as something that we should essentially like mirror in Taiwan. I think, there's even been anonymous U.S. officials saying that to mainstream media outlets about how we should be duplicating the Ukraine strategy in Taiwan. So there's definitely American officials who are, I think, psychotically seeing Ukraine as like a practice round for what they could maybe do against the real, like, bigger challenger of U.S. hegemony, which is China. So I'm just curious, like, do you think that there is a chance that the U.S. could open another front over Taiwan with China? And judging by how the U.S. public has really been primed to support any action that is perceived to be anti-Russia, no matter how lunatic it is, we kind of see something similar happening with China. Do you fear that we'll have a similar problem of like almost no backlash? I guess, Medea, let's start with you.
Oh, I was going to say, let's start with Ann, because she's in the thick of things where she
Actually,
is.
that's true. Actually, geographically speaking, I mean, Hawaii is essentially, stolen land that we call America, that is used as like essentially a U.S. military base to project power in the Asia Pacific. So yeah, go ahead, Ann. You take it first.
Well, actually, it is true. I mean, when you look at the U.S., what the U.S. is doing in Asia and the Pacific, it is provoking, as we did for provoking Russia on the issue of Ukraine. We're provoking China on Taiwan. We're provoking the North Koreans. In fact, one of the largest military war maneuvers in decades is still underway in South Korea, where we have B-2 bombers. We've got all sorts of aircraft. And the North Koreans are responding saying, well, you bunch of idiots, what are you trying to do? Make us, send more missiles, practice missiles and things like that. I mean, South Korea is really in a big trouble because they have got a right-wing new president who is willing to take all of the military exercises that the U.S. wants to give him, where in the past, the previous government and Trump suspended all the military exercises in South Korea. And for 5 years almost, there was not a confrontation. But as soon as Biden came in, the North Koreans, in military exercises, the North Koreans started firing missiles saying, don't keep doing this stuff to us. On Taiwan, it's the same thing. I mean, the provocation of the mainland Chinese by the huge numbers of U.S. Military delegations and congressional delegations, culminating with Nancy Pelosi, despite a lot of warning, like, don't do this. Well, the Chinese, they have been the naval confrontations that are going on, where the U.S. has had aircraft armadas, which each aircraft has 10 vessels that are around it and submarines. And we've had numerous armadas that are going through the South China Sea, through the Straits of Taiwan. The Chinese are being more aggressive now in countering and shadowing U.S. naval armadas. They're shadowing them with ships also. And just today, here's an announcement that the Chinese are inaugurating champagne on the bows of 22 new ships. So it's like they're saying, this is our front yard. This is where we live. You guys are doing to us kind of what you've done to Europe for all these years. And the whole issue of NATO, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is a full partner with the U.S. and Ukraine. Now there is a Pacific equivalent of it, that we have NATO nations that are coming into the Pacific in war games and naval exercises, Rim of the Pacific, which was last year, and then we'll be having the Talisman Sabre land exercises that'll be going on in Australia in July and August. And NATO forces are a part of these. And now NATO countries are identifying or nominating or sending in their own Pacific envoys. We've just had in Honolulu the Pacific envoy for Germany, the Pacific envoy for France, and last week was the annual meeting of all U.S. ambassadors for Asia and the Pacific. And it's a joint military meeting with our Indo-Pacific Command here in Honolulu. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. The U.S. Embassy in the Solomon Islands has now been created to counter the Chinese who went into Solomon Islands and had a security agreement with them. Well, all of a sudden, Solomon Islands becomes on the radar of the United States, which it had not been since World War II. And we have opened a micro embassy in Solomon Islands.
And then Medea, I don't know if you wanted to add to the stuff about a potential war with China, what that might mean for the anti-war movement, and trying to rally back, trying to rally progressives. Because I think CODEPINK played a role with other organizations and sort of like trying to lobby progressive Congress people to push back against the lack of diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, we have a campaign called China's Not Our Enemy, where we try to educate people that neither the Chinese government nor the Chinese people are our enemy, and that if the U.S. government feels threatened by what China is doing around the world, maybe it should take a closer look at it and learn from them. That instead of going in with our military and occupying countries, China is going in with a lot of money and creating projects. Some of them might be not so good environmentally or getting countries into debt, but for the most part, they're win-win situations where local infrastructure projects improve the lives of people, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, and China is becoming the number one trading partner of most countries around the world. So the US needs to learn from that. Also, I think we have to look at what's happening in Russia from that geopolitical standpoint, where US officials see weakening of Russia as part of a larger strategy so that Russia will not be a strong ally when it comes to confronting China. We should also recognize that some of those Republicans who are questioning the tremendous support that we're giving to Ukraine are saying instead we should not be looking at Russia as our number one enemy, but as China as our number one enemy. So there is a lot to do to get people to understand how horrific the war is in Ukraine right now, and how much worse it would be if we were fighting a war against China. So if there's any lesson to be learned about Ukraine, I hope it is not that the US would be ready to go in militarily to support Taiwan. The lesson is really use diplomacy so that these conflicts don't break out to begin with.
A year ago, we saw Russia invade. So there's going to be many markings of this 1 year anniversary. And if I look back on the last year, the couple things that still really stick out in my mind is, first off, how easy it's been for people in media pundits, or whether it's politicians, how easy it's been for them to minimize the threat of nuclear weapons and make it seem like, oh, that's just a silly thing. The Russians would never deploy nuclear weapons and use them in the conflict. But then also the way, it became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that Russia was going to invade Ukraine in February of last year, because there wasn't any attempt or any interest, it seemed, on the part of the US government to pull them off the ramp that was leading towards an invasion. They seemed to egg them on, in my view. And then finally, and you both can react to any of this. And finally, I've been following how this is related to my work on the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. I've been following how our allies in Europe, and then, Australia, Canada being part of the Five Eyes, Australia is going to be taking a pivotal role in the countering of China on behalf of the US. I've been looking at how these espionage laws are being expanded in a way that is intended to target journalists and whistleblowers, because they don't want material to get out in the open that will reflect negatively on NATO. And they're making it a crime. Like, if you publish information or spread information that will do damage to international relations, that could be something that could get you, dragged into court, and you could face legal jeopardy. And we need to remember, I mean, Ann was talking about the Bill Burns revelation that we know of, what he was saying about the threat of NATO. That comes from the state embassy cables that were published by WikiLeaks. There's this really great article that was done for this peace organization that is working on to basically make the conflict less intense between US and Russia. Branko Marcetic wrote this very good article looking at all the cables that came out and what they show about what we knew about, what officials knew about Ukraine. And so this information, this is stuff that we need to not see suppressed. We're actually making a protracted war more likely right now, because we're seeing this ramping up among countries, that they're going to tighten everything and not share information with journalists, try to intimidate whistleblowers who might come forward and tell us what's going wrong in the conflict. Things like, we talked about this on this show previously, that the Ukraine has a really big problem when it comes to global arms trafficking. I'm sure that's probably a part of the corruption that Zelensky is dealing with.
How we are able to communicate to our own community, and the need for investigative journalism, the need to be able to get information that comes out in things like WikiLeaks. And thank you so much for your long time reporting on Julian Assange and our efforts to make sure he's not extradited to the United States, but released from this terrible prison situation in the UK. But whistleblowers are a key part of all of this. And that the fact that the United States is becoming even as authoritarian as many of the countries that we rail against about putting journalists in jail and for releasing embarrassing but accurate information about what our government's doing. The whole issue of being a whistleblower, of using, for example, the dissent channel in the State Department to challenge what the narrative is that the bosses in Department of Defense and the State Department and the NSC are doing is so critical. And if our country starts hammering down on these outlets for legitimate information that the public needs to know, then we're in bigger trouble than we already are in. But on the whole issue of ramping up things in Asia and the Pacific to reflect kind of what's happened in Europe with Ukraine, I'll just mention Secretary of Defense Austin is in the region right now. He was in South Korea 2 days ago. He was in the Philippines yesterday, and a new pact with the Philippine government that the U.S. has authorization to use at any time it wants 6 military bases. And in Australia, I mentioned the military exercises will be happening this summer, but the United States has already contracted and is now at the end of the building of a 60 million gallon jet fuel storage tank complex in the city of Darwin, Australia, that will be used to fuel the military ships and aircraft that will be continuing to go all throughout the Western Pacific.
So if I could just add to this issue about the need to know, wouldn't it have been nice if we had journalists or even the kind of release of information to let us know the extent of U.S. involvement in the 2014 uprising that led to the coup there? We have that one leaked audio tape with Victoria Nuland talking to the U.S. ambassador, but imagine the reams and reams of communications that we should be able to, we should have known back then, and we should certainly be able to know now to understand just how intimately involved the U.S. was in orchestrating the change of government in Ukraine. And then came the Minsk Accords in 2015. We hear now from Angela Merkel and from Francois Hollande that were in power in Germany and France at the time, saying, oh, well, that agreement really wasn't to end the conflict. It was to buy time. And buying time meant to be able to arm Ukraine, train the military so that they could recapture Donbass or be ready for the invasion that took place now. If we had known back then what was the real intent behind not only the signing of those accords, but why didn't Europe or the US or the Security Council do anything over the years to have that agreement implemented? And now today, we hear nothing in the mainstream press about what do people in the Donbass and Crimea really feel? What is their sense of what self-determination would look like? We only hear the narrative that self-determination means that all Ukrainians want every piece of Ukraine back in the hands of this government. And we don't, there are journalists who are in those regions, but they don't get a voice on mainstream press. And then when there is the rare occasion that a person who questions this war gets onto television, like in the case of Jeffrey Sachs, and he was questioned about the Nord Stream pipeline, they immediately cut him off when he said that it was probably the US that did that sabotage. So there are so many things we don't know that we should know, that we need to know. And we need more of the leaks. We need more of the principled diplomats like Ann Wright to come out and say this, resign over this. And we need journalists who really give us the truth from a lot of different perspectives.
I want to ask the both of you about the stakes. I'm not suggesting that this war is any less worthy of opposing than other wars, but there are certainly higher stakes when it comes to this war with Ukraine. And one thing that's so alarming is to hear US officials flirting with the idea that some sort of low level like nuclear warfare with like small nukes. I'm not really sure what that means, but this term small nukes has been floated as it wouldn't actually be the end of the world. Can you talk about like why the stakes are so high? Like why is this one of the most important and dangerous moments of this century so far? What are we at risk of? What kind of fire are we playing with here? And I guess Ann, let's start with you, since you live in Hawaii, and you know.
Well, the use of tactical nuclear weapons has been a part of the U.S. military arsenal, although pushed aside for decades. But now to hear it being talked again about being a legitimate weapon system to be used in conflicts is horrifying, because a tactical nuke is followed on by a bigger nuke, by a bigger one, and then the whole thing's just totally out of control. When you first use a tactical nuke, that means you're down a pathway that's going to end in horrible things. And the fact that people in the defense industry and the think tank industry are talking about this a lot of that actually comes more from the think tankers rather than actual military folks. That the military folks know exactly how disastrous that would be. The think tankers need to have yet one more thing to add to their article or to their webinar and like that. I would hope that in our military there is a strong push saying never, don't get us going down that way. However, you never can tell. I mean, it was Secretary Austin of the Defense Department that was saying, no, we don't want to have U.S. military tanks going into Ukraine. And yet he was having to stand behind Biden at the press conference when Biden announced it. It was kind of like George Tenet having to stand behind Colin Powell when they were talking about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The fact that really no one in the U.S. government has resigned over this, although in Russia we have had one diplomat that resigned, just one, and I'm sure he got the hell out of Russia really fast after he did that. But the whole issue of the discussion even of the use of tactical nuclear weapons is horrifying.
I find it quite remarkable that people will say Putin is a maniac, Putin is irrational, Putin can't be believed or trusted for anything, but he won't use nuclear weapons. He's just bluffing when it comes to nuclear weapons. And, that's just amazing. And I like to go back to what John F. Kennedy said a year after his negotiations with Khrushchev, saying that if you're in a confrontation with a nuclear power, never put them in the position where the only options are a humiliating retreat or the use of a nuclear weapon. And that's exactly what we're doing. Biden has once uttered the phrase nuclear Armageddon, not in any kind of policy speech, but at a fundraiser. But he knows that, and he said before that Putin needs an off-ramp. But instead of offering an off-ramp, what we are doing is just pushing him deeper and deeper into that corner. And when it comes to off-ramps, I think there are many things that the U.S. could offer that would be a compromise on that larger geopolitical war between the U.S. and Russia. And that is looking at the issue of arms reduction, the treaties that the U.S. has pulled out of, the issue of U.S. nuclear weapons in 5 countries in Europe, the issue of a U.S. base, not only in Romania, but in Poland that's 100 miles from the Russian border. All of these things could and should be negotiated as part of solving not only the conflict in Ukraine, but really creating a stable region in Europe. And lastly, I would say, perhaps one of the positive things that could come out of this, if we don't all end up destroyed by nuclear weapons, is that there would be a realization in Europe that hooking their security onto the United States has not been a good deal for them, and they have to create a separate entity for Europe without the United States to create a real security architecture for Europe.
And if I could just add, the Republicans having the House of Representatives actually may work to our benefit, because Biden could say, as much as there are some off ramps, but I need to have the backing of, someone. And if the Democrats were totally in charge of both of the houses, if he offered any of these off ramps, he'd be crucified. But where you have the Republicans now in charge of the House, and they've already started questioning the amount of money, this may be a way that he says, okay, you Republicans, you don't want all of this money going in here. Here's something we can do to maybe back off this. But I don't know. He's been a warmonger all his life, so I'm not too sure that's gonna
change.
Well, I know we need to wrap up our conversation, but whether it's a truce or an armistice or some kind of agreement, it's absolutely would be better than pouring more weapons and all kinds of different military equipment into Ukraine. And I think it would be a mistake if we didn't just quickly mention, as we conclude here, what we saw happen in the last several days with the U.S. actually having Israel bomb Iran so that it could destroy its capability to export drone aircraft to Russia. And if we're talking about stakes and how this could blow up and get even worse, that just seeing that happen shows you how many more countries could be entangled in this conflict.
Absolutely. Having Israel getting involved in bombing yet again Iran, or whether they're going to bomb Syria, or whether they're going to bomb Lebanon or wherever, it just it's brutal. And what the Israeli government is doing to camouflage in a way all of the terrible things they're doing to the Palestinians. And then I would suspect they want, give us a little credit for bombing the drone industry in Iran, but don't harass us about all of the terrible things we're doing to the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, which has come under Israeli rocket attack again today.
Yeah.
And just to say about how this could be extended, if indeed we go now the route of sending in these fighter jets, there's talk that they would have to be based in Poland. And right there, you have another recipe for getting a NATO country directly involved in the conflict. And it seems inevitable that some missile or something will land in a NATO country, like it almost did in the case of Poland. And then Article 5 will be invoked, and then you will see European troops or U.S. troops that are already in Europe. We have 100,000 troops in Europe getting directly involved in this. So the consequences and the possibility of this expanding are very real. And that's why we formed this coalition called Peace in Ukraine, and people can go to peaceinukraine.org to join us. There is this protest in Washington, D.C. coming up on February 19th. Ann and I will be organizing a lobbying day in Congress on February 21st, where we want to flood the halls of Congress with people demanding a ceasefire and negotiations. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we encourage your viewers to join us.
Well, thank you. We really appreciated being able to talk with both of you, and you've been crucial voices. And we don't have much of an anti-war movement, but we'd have zero anti-war movement if you were not out there trying to rally the forces and challenge what's going on in Washington. So thank you both.
Thank
you.
you. Great
Thanks.
to be on with you.